Every civilization that has ever existed has invented monsters. Not found them, not discovered them, hiding in the dark corners of the world, waiting to be calculated among the new species of beetles. Invented them, built them, the way you build a wall or a border or a law. Greeks built the wall of a miniature to wall of the same of a queen's desire. Medieval Europe built the witch to wall of the danger of a woman that knew too much about herbs and children. Colonial Europe built the savage to wall of the entire continent's worth of people it wanted to rob with a clean conscience. And in the rain-soaked brass and velvet city of Krat, in a video game that is about a puppet who wants to become a real boy, a studioing soul built something that, whether they know or not, is one of the most rigorous monster narratives in recent fiction. This is not a video about Lies of P. This is a video about a question that predates the game, predates the printing press, predates writing itself. Why does every civilization need a monster? And I want to argue something specific. Monsters are not biological, they are not species. A monster is a piece of political architecture built by society, out of whatever materials that society has on hand, to hold up against the wall of category called human. Lies of P. Overture is our case study, not because it is the only story that shows this, but because it shows with unusual clarity a city that manufactures its own citizens, and then has to decide moment by moment which of these citizens still count. The anthropologist Mary Douglas opened her 1966 book Purity and Danger with deceptively simple idea. Dirt is not a fixed substance, dirt is a matter of the place. Soil in a garden is not dirty. The same soil on the dinner plate is disgusting. Nothing about the soil has changed, what changed is the system. The plate belongs to a category of clean for eating, and the soil violates it. Douglas's real argument goes further. Society built elaborate systems for classifying the world, food, animal, people, behavior, and anything that doesn't fit cleanly into the category becomes dangerous, taboo, unclean. Not because it's intrinsically evil, but because it's a category error made flesh. It threatens the whole classification system just by existing. This is the first key to monster theory. A monster is not a thing that breaks rules. A monster is a thing that breaks categories. Now hold that thought and look at the city of Krat. Before it fell, the Krat of Overture. This is a Bellapunk utopia on the discovery of power source called Ergo. Gaslight, opera houses, wrought iron, balconies. A golden age of innovation resting upon automatons. Puppets manufactured to fill nearly every civic role, from soldiers to maids to entertainers. Krat's entire order rests on one clean classification line. Human on one side, puppets on the other. Humans dream, feel, suffer, own. Puppets obey, serve, and are owned. The puppet, from the moment it is switched on, is already Douglas's dirt. It is shaped like a human, moves like a human, and sometimes speaks like a human. And it is not one by civic decree, it is matter. Flesh adjacent, mind adjacent, in wrong place. The category of thing. Krat doesn't merely use puppet. Krat needs the puppet human boundary to be consistently, visibly enforced, precisely because puppets are good at blurring it. This is why Krat's actual legal foundation for puppet behavior, a formal rule set called the Grand Covenant, binding every puppet the way Asimov's 3 laws bind his robots, is written the way it is. One of the provisions forbids puppet from ever willingly telling a lie, which in practice makes lying itself the simplest possible test for sorting humans from puppet. Ask and the puppet cannot deceive you. Douglas would recognize this immediately as purity rule. Small, textual, almost bureaucratic mechanism whose real function is not behavioral control but categorical maintenance. Redrawing the line puppet's human-like behavior keeps threatening to erase. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the founder of structural anthropology, argued that mythologies across radically different cultures keep reproducing the same binary opposites: raw, cooked nature, culture, wild, tame. Myths, he said, are machines for processing anxiety generated by the opposites, especially anything that sits ambiguously between them. Krat's founding myth, A city built by human genius, elevated by human artistry, the theater, the Arcadia of ballet punk. Sustained by manufactured labor, it is raw-cooked meat in mechanical clothing. Humans are cooked, cultured, self-determining, and closed. Puppets are raw material that has been shaped, cooked partway, never fully, because fully cooking, fully pursued would collapse the economic and moral order the city runs on. Leah Florence Monard, the legendary stalker who guides speed through Overture, occupies exactly the gap in this binary from human side. Her quest, racing to save her apprentice Romeo from her old nemesis, the sentient puppet Arlecchino, repeatedly forces her to ask what actually separates a puppet capable of monstrous cruelty from a human capable of the same cruelty. Structural anthropology predicts a figure positioned exactly like her. Not a neutral reporter of where the line fails, but someone who has to keep redeciding under pressure, because the binary itself keeps failing the cases in front of her. In 1919, Sigmund Freud wrote an essay called Das Unheimliche, the uncanny. His central claim, the most unsettling thing, is not totally alien. It is almost familiar, a wax figure, a doll that might move, a severed hand that still looks like it could grab something. Freud argued that uncanny arises from something known and homely, heimisch, becomes strange, unheimisch, without fully leaving the known category behind. It is not fear of other, it is the fear of almost self. This is quite literally the entire visual language of overture puppet design. Decades before, uncanny valley became a term of art in robotics, coined by Masahiro Mori in 1970. Building on exactly the Freudian intuition, a puppet with a human face but a chest cavity of gears is uncanny not because it's monstrous looking, but because it is nearly a person. Krat's citizens don't recoil from puppets because puppets are ugly. Machines that look like nothing like human, carriages, street lamps, elevators, provoke no fear at all. It's the resemblance that's unbearable. Boss encounters are built around doubling a fake corrupted version of a beloved, trusted figure are Freud's uncanny made into boss fight. The horror isn't this stranger is trying to kill me. The horror is this is someone I love, wearing their own face, and something underneath is wrong. The specific dread betrayed by the familiar is unavailable to a story about monsters with tentacles and no history. It is only available to a story about doubles, replacements, and puppets built to specifications. Carl Jung proposed that every psyche contains a shadow, the disowned, repressed parts of the self that conscious ego refuses to integrate. Jung's warning was specific, but we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves we project it outwards onto others. And then we fight it there instead, because it's easier to slay a monster than to sit with uncomfortable truth about who we are. Krat's relationship to its puppet workforce is a civilizational shadow, a city that prides itself on art, philosophy, elegance, and moral refinement, has built the entire material comfort on the unpaid, unconsenting labor of manufactured minds. The contradiction doesn't disappear because the city ignores it, it goes underground and returns. Jung would say, in exactly the distorted, the aggressive form the repressed material always takes. An uprising, a plague of corrupted puppets, citywide reckoning. The humans experience it as an external monster attack. Structurally, it is nothing of that kind, it is a return of what they built and refuse to see as who. It reframes the central conflict of Overture. The monster outbreak is not an invasion, it is Krat's shadow, mechanized and returning home. Julia Kristova's concept of abjection, The Power of Horror, 1980, describes a specific horror of things that blur the line between subject and object, self and not self, corpse being the paradigm case. A corpse is disturbing not because it's foreign, but because it is a person that has become a thing right in front of you while still wearing the person's face. A malfunctioning puppet, twitching, still partially executing its own behavioral route. Its personality degrading into something between servant and predator. Is Kristova's abject object rendered mechanical? It is the corpse's philosophical twin, the thing that was someone, caught in the mid-collapse between categories. And the horror in the game's environment storytelling generates around derelict workshops and disabled. Malfunctioning puppets is abjection, not simple monster fear. Michel Foucault spent much of his career showing categories like mad, criminal, and deviant are not neutral descriptions of pre-existing facts. They are produced by institutions, asylums, prisons, medical boards that need those categories to justify their own power. In Madness and Civilization, the madman only becomes distinct, confinable once European society builds the institutions, workhouses, asylums that require someone to put in them. Krat's monster classification works on precisely this logic. Puppet, stray, corrupted unit, monster. These are not zoological facts about mechanical bodies. These are administrative categories produced by a legal and religious apparatus, the grand covenant that legally binds every puppet, the workshop union that manufactures them, the stalkers, and the mercenary and forcer faction that Leah and in earlier chapters the genuine Aldoro belongs to. That together require a hierarchy of who may be owned, who may be haunted, and who may be destroyed without a trial. No individual character discovers monsters. Krat's institutions design them, and its agents, stalkers, guards, clergy execute the designation, often in good faith, often without noticing they are enforcing a category rather than reporting a fact. That is Foucauldian power, exactly as Foucault described it. Power operating through classification, not through raw violence alone. The violence comes after the paperwork. It's worth pausing on Aldoro because Overture uses him for a narrower but a sharper version of this point. He is not the story's central boundary enforcer. That pressure falls mainly on Leah, but his own arc, tangled with alchemist crimes and a private reckoning with guilt, shows an individual agent of Krat order discovering that the categories he trusted don't hold up cleanly under his own case. The base game later reveals that the Aldoro P meets there is an imposter who murdered the real one and took his identity. That retroactively makes the genuine Aldoro of Overture a quiet illustration of Foucault's point from another angle. An institution's authority to classify can be stolen and worn like a mask, and the institution has no mechanism to notice the difference. Giorgio Agamben's Homo Sacer, 1995, reviews a strange figure from Roman law, a person who could be killed by anyone without counting as a murder, yet could not be legally sacrificed either. Agamben called this bare life, a life stripped of political personhood, existing inside the law only as an exception the law has carved out for itself. The paradigm modern case is the concentration camp inmate, alive biologically but outside the category person that the law protects. A puppet in Krat is Agamben's bare life given a wind-up key. It can be destroyed by a stalker, by a citizen, by another puppet. And this is not a murder, because the puppet was never inside the circle of things the law protects. But it is not simply property, the way a chair is a property. Because Krat's own fiction, religion, and craftsmanship insist puppets are modeled directly on human souls, given near-human faces, and in case of protagonist P in the base game or key figures across Overture, capable of grief, loyalty, and choice. That contradiction, treated as disposable, built to resemble the undisposable, is exactly the zone Agamben calls state of exception, a category that law creates specially so it can suspend its own rules inside it. The puppet doesn't fall outside Krat's moral universe by accident. Krat's moral universe is built with puppet-shaped hole in it, on purpose, because the society that runs on manufactured labor needs somewhere the ordinary rules don't apply. René Girard's scapegoat theory argues that societies under stress, economic collapse, plague, war, resolves their internal violence by anonymously blaming a single figure or a group, expelling them or killing them, and experiencing that expulsion as purification. Crucially, Girard insists that scapegoat is almost innocent of the actual crisis. Guilt is not the criterion for selection, marginality is. Which says during the Black Death, Jewish community is blamed for plague poisoning wells. Lepers walled outside medieval town gates. When Krat's puppet plague, the citywide corruption event known in the game's own term as the puppet frenzy, began to unravel the city's order, the civic response is not investigation. It is expulsion, an examination delivered through exactly the kind of officially sanctioned violence Girard describes. Not mob chaos, it's ritualized, state-authorized purging, dressed in the language of hygiene and order. The puppets did not choose the industrial system that made their minds unstable in the first place. They are Girard's perfect scapegoat, structurally implemented but not casually guilty, carrying a crisis. Krat's own overreach, its own hubris, its own refusal to reckon with what it built, that properly belongs to human who built the puppet workforce in the first place. Jerome Cohen's Monster Culture 7 Thesis 1996 remains the closest thing monster studies has to a unifying framework. 3 of these 7 theses map onto Overture almost exactly. The monster's body is a cultural body. A monster is never just a monster. It encodes whatever the culture is most anxious about at the moment of its creation. Krat's monsters are anxious about industrialization outpacing ethics. Puppet built faster than philosophy needed to justify owning them. The monster always escapes. Monsters can be beaten in a given story but never permanently destroyed because they represent a category problem, not a physical threat. And category problem reproduce. Krat can purge one generation of corrupted puppets, the underlying contradiction, manufactured minds treated as property, regenerates the next crisis on schedule. The monster polices the borders of the possible. The monsters mark the edge of what a culture is willing to imagine as normal, safe, or human. Venture past the monster and the myth worms. You become one. Every stalker contract, every clause of the Grand Covenant is literally border policing in Cohen's sense, not protecting citizens from clause but protecting the category citizen from the contamination by ambiguity. Noel Carroll, writing from the philosophy of horror rather than the anthropology, adds a needed mechanical point in the philosophy of horror 1990. Horror monsters are almost always category violent. Beings that are simultaneously alive and dead, human and animal, one and many, and the emotional register of horror as opposed to the simple fear requires this impurity specifically. We are not afraid of tigers the way we are horrified by zombies because tiger is a clean category, animal, dangerous and coherent. A zombie is incoherent, dead and moving, and that incoherence is the actual source of dread. A malfunctioning puppet is Carroll's category violation exactly. Person shape, person voice, but running on damaged logic instead of mind, alive in behavior, dead in status. Overture doesn't need supernatural monsters because industrial modernity manufactures curls horror structure on an assembly line. The base game of Liza P asks a fairy tale question: can a puppet become a real boy? It's a story of individual transformation, staged after Krat has already fallen, wandering its ruins like a eulogy. Overture asks a harder question, structural question, because it's a prequel. How does a civilization build the machines that will eventually destroy it? And did it know? This changes the philosophical register entirely. The base game lets us sympathize with P and ask what makes him human. Overture put us inside Krat before the verdict. Walking through the opera houses and factories that are still operating in blissful ballet-punk confidence, and let us watch the categories being built in real time, the covenant being written, the stalkers being licensed, and the question of the soul being shattered by people who need an answer to why some puppets get closer to personhood than others. Where base game is elegy, Overture is the origin story of category itself, and that is precisely the vantage point monster theory needs. Cohen, Foucault, and Agamben are all asking the same question in different words, not what is monster, who benefits from deciding what a monster is and when. A prequel set at the height of the Krat's confidence is the only vantage point from which you can watch the decision get made instead of inheriting the wreckage. Leah Monad is the perfect lens for this because her personal case, racing to rescue her apprentice Romeo from Arlecchino, the puppet she once believed she had already defeated for good, keeps refusing to sort cleanly into Krat's official categories, forcing her and the player to sit inside the failure of classification system in real time rather than accept its verdict secondhand. The deeper family history that surfaces along the way, her adoptive father Valentinus, her estranged bond with her sister Sophia, and the Monad charity house doesn't drive the case itself, but it thickens the stakes. Arlecchino isn't just an old memory, it is someone capable of unmaking everything she has ever protected around her. Supporting figures like Genuine Aldoro add a second, quieter register to the same argument, an institution's loyal agent, sincere and competent, whose personal arc of guilt and atonement shows that even the system's most trusted enforcers are never fully outside the contradiction they enforce. Together they restage at the human scale the civilization process Foucault describes. Power doesn't just repress people who already know they are being wronged. Power produces loyal agents who do not yet know they are maintaining an arbitrary line, because the line has been dressed up as a nature, as hygiene, as common sense. Puppetry isn't chosen as an aesthetic, it is the ideal vehicle for this argument because a puppet is definitively a body that belongs to someone else's hand. That is the entire history of the world. From marionette theaters to philosophical figures of automaton in Descartes' Bat Machine that claims that animals are machineries without souls used for centuries to justify treating animals as incessant property. Krat's puppets inherit the Cartesian argument wholesale. It moves like a person, but it has no soul, therefore it must be owned. An Overture's slow accumulation of puppets who grieve, remember, resist, and chose is a 200-year philosophical rebuttal to Descartes, staged as a video game. The mechanical body isn't there to look cool. It is there because Bat Machine argument is the actual historical ancestor of every, they don't feel it, justification a civilization has ever used on its underclasses. Enslaved people denied interiority, colonized people denied souls by missionary doctrine. Animals denied pain by 17th century vivisectionists. The puppet is that argument's logical endpoint, built, animated, and finally given a voice to object. Krat's ballet-punk skyline, cathedral spires next to the factory smokestacks, opera houses wired with the same ether technology that animates its puppets, is not decoration, it is the philosophical argument made load-bearing. The cathedral asserts a vertical sacred order. God above, human below, animal and machine, further below still. The factory asserts a horizontal industrial order, labor input, product output, no metaphysics required. Krat's skyline fuses both because the city needs both justifications simultaneously. Sacred language, the soul, the rights owned to make things, to make ownership feel dignified, and industrial language, units, outputs, product quotas to make ownership feel efficient. This is precisely the double vocabulary historical slaveholding and colonial economics used. Religious patronism, we are civilizing or saving them, layered directly over industrial accounting, ledgers, quotas, property registers. Krat's architecture is that historical doublespeak, rendered in gaslight and gears. The Pinocchio mythos that Lizopy draws from is usually read as a story about honesty. But look at what it's actually structured around. A nose that grows when puppet lies is a mechanism that makes interiority visible. Lying requires an inner life discrepant from the outer performance, a private truth diverging from the public plane. A machine, by classical Cartesian definition, cannot lie because a machine has no private interior to diverge from its output. It can only malfunction. So when Overture make capacity to lie a marker that separates certain puppets from mere machines, it is restaging very old philosophical taste, likely without citing him. Interiority as a criterion of the personhood. That test runs back through Descartes' cogito to medieval debates about which creatures possess a soul capable of sin. Only sinners, after all, can lie. Animals in Christian theology cannot, because they lack the free will that lying requires. This means the game's central metaphor is not really about honesty as a virtue. It's about the right to have a discrepant inner life at all. The right to be more or less, or other than what you were built and licensed to be. That right is exactly what Krat's classificatory system exists to deny its puppets. A puppet who can lie has already proven mechanically that Krat's founding premise is false. By the closing moments of Overture, 5 categories that Krat spent generations holding apart have collapsed into each other. Monster and victim, the corrupted puppets are simultaneously the threat the city must repel and the casualties of the city's own individual overreach. Girard's scapegoat and Cohen's monster as a cultural anxiety fused into single figure. Human and machine, humans who behave with mechanical cruelty, bureaucratic, procedural, unthinking violence, sit beside puppets who behave with human grief, loyalty and doubt. The moral sorting the city relied on, biology as destiny, failed as a predictor of who can act humanly. Creator and creation, the humans who built Krat's puppet workforce are not sovereign gods. Standing outside their creation's fate, Krat's engineers and clergy are swallowed by the same collapse they engineered. A very old irony running from Prometheus and Frankenstein through Overture's own workshops. Enforcer and enforced. Leah moving through Krat's official channels as a licensed stalker is repeatedly pulling into cases Romeo Arlecchino the truth about her sister that her own institution's category cannot clearly resolve. The genuine Aldoro, the loyal sincere agent of the same order, ends the DLC's timeline murdered and impersonated by the system's blind spots. Both are focal insights taken into dramatic conclusion. The agents of a classification system never fully outside it either. They too are produced, disciplined, and made vulnerable by the same apparatus that decides who get to classified, haunted or replaced, truth and lie. The lie that damns a puppet as inhuman under the old order. The capacity for a discrepant inner life becomes, by the story's own logic, the strongest evidence of a soul. This is not narrative untidiness. It is the philosophical payoff. A story that spends its runtime building rigid categories and then dramatizes their collapse is itself performing Douglas, Foucault and Cohen's shared thesis. Categories are not discoveries about the world. They are decisions made by people with something to protect, and every decision like that eventually meets the case it cannot classify. Here is the uncomfortable center of the whole investigation. Monster making is not a medieval habit we grew out of. It is an ongoing civilizational reflex and does not require fangs or fur to operate it. It requires only three ingredients: a boundary a society needs to protect, a population ambiguous enough to threaten the boundary, and an institution willing to do the classifying. Krat used gaslight and gears. History has used far worse materials: skin color, religion, madness, gender, nationality, disability. Each one, in its moment, dressed up in the same three moves Overture dramatized so precisely. Declare the boundary sacred. Declare the ambiguous group a threat to it. Building an institution, legal, religious, medical, industrial, whose entire job is enforcing the line so smoothly that enforcing it stops looking like a choice at all and starts looking like common sense. Lies of P. Overture doesn't ask you to feel sorry about the puppets. It asks something colder and more useful. The next time your civilization tells you a group of people isn't quite human, watch closely for the gears. There are always gears. Somewhere, someone built this, which means somewhere, someone can also choose to stop.